I'd like to introduce JP from Tasmania, who's going to tell us a little bit about the dwarf Asian honeybee and deformed wing virus. Thank you, JP.
Thank you, Barry. I thought I would report on is an incursion of red dwarf bees, which are Apis florea in Western Australia. And I've been researching that as part of a large report that I'm writing called the Australian Pollination Security Status Report. And that's currently what I'm involved in. And it's related to deformed wing virus. So we'll first give a little bit of an introduction about deformed wing virus. I apologize to the people from New Zealand who are probably very familiar with that, but here in Australia, we are much less familiar with deformed wing virus. So it's a positive strand RNA virus. You can see a picture of it here. As the name suggests, it results in bees which have deformed wings. And in this particular bee, you can already see there is 2 Varroa mites attached to the thorax of this bee. We'll not go into too much detail, but it has 3 main structural proteins and 3 proteins that are involved in the replication of this virus. So it's a fairly simple virus. It's a very small virus, but it's a very lethal virus as well. There has been a strong association, as the picture in the previous slide suggests, between Varroa and deformed wing virus. And in a study in Hawaii, the reference is down here, a study in Hawaii suggested that if Varroa is present on one of the islands of Hawaii, then there is a very high prevalence of deformed wing virus. 80% or so of the hives with Varroa in that island had deformed wing virus. On the other hand, the next island down, Maui, had very few deformed wing virus present. And the Varroa mite is known to actually transmit the deformed wing virus. Not only that, but the deformed wing virus can actually replicate inside Varroa. So Varroa is actually a host for deformed wing virus, not only honeybees. And we will come back to that later because some of that will become quite important in the presentation. So deformed wing virus has a very broad species preference, and I wasn't really aware of that. I thought of deformed wing virus really as a bee pathogen, but it's actually an insect pathogen, and that's something that I hadn't quite realized. But there's a paper here in the Annual Review of Virology that looked in great detail in that. And one of the things that is clear is that it not only infects all sorts of bees, honeybees, obviously, 4 different species, though that includes Apis cerana and Apis mellifera, obviously, but also 11 species of bumblebees, some solitary bees, including the leafcutter bee, which incidentally was imported in Australia in 2006 as part of an insect that could be used for pollinating, particularly lucerne. It's very good at doing that. And so it was imported for that particular purpose. We don't know what the status is in terms of deformed wing virus in those imported leafcutter bees. They are used extensively overseas for lucerne pollination, particularly in Canada. Some stingless bees of the same family as, and this is not the same species as the ones that we have in Australia, but it's the same family of stingless bees, but also ants, social wasps, and solitary wasps. And in the terms of social wasps, that includes also wasps that we have here, the European wasps that we have here in Australia, which were imported. So that wasp can actually be infected with deformed wing virus as well. True bugs and beetles. Interestingly enough, amongst the beetles that they have tested, they tested small hive beetle, and yes, it can be infected with deformed wing virus. So that's an interesting observation because small hive beetle, of course, is a pest of honeybees. And most of you in the mainland in Australia will have seen small hive beetles in your hives. Fortunately, in Tasmania, we don't have them, but everywhere else, there seems to be present. So it's endemic in parts of Australia, and it can actually be infected with deformed wing virus. Flies, including drone flies, which again have been used for pollination, so they can be infected as well with deformed wing virus. Some species of moths and butterflies, earwigs, cockroaches, spiders, and harvest moths, including in that range, of course, Varroa destructor and Tropilelaps. From this slide, it's clear that deformed wing virus can infect a very wide range of species. Obviously, this is a study that was done overseas because we don't have deformed wing virus. but it also should be clear from that quite a number of imported insects from Australia can be infected. And considering the very wide range of species here, it's very likely that a large number of our native species of insects will be able to be infected by the Deformed Wing Virus. So that's something to keep in mind when going through this talk, something that I was not aware of. Now let's talk a little bit about the red dwarf honeybees. It's Apis florea. It's a very small bee. It's typically a lot smaller than Apis mellifera. That's why it's called dwarf, and it's red-brown in color. You can see a very nice picture here of this wonderful bee. It has an open comb under a branch, forms colonies, but it forms just one big comb that hangs under a branch, not unlike the giant honeybee in Asia, but this is a much smaller one. It produces very little honey and moves quite fast and abandons the colony quite fast as it reproduces. It has never been domesticated as such, and it's just a wild bee, quite prevalent in big parts of Asia. In fact, where it can be found, the distribution is all over South Asia, going from the Mediterranean, the Middle East, part of Egypt, all the way to Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, India, and then all into Southeast Asia. So it's actually not that far away from where we are. And of course, there is a lot of traffic between Asia and Australia, particularly with shipping. Now, there was an incursion of this red dwarf honeybee in the Burrup Peninsula in Western Australia, and it's quite a remote area. You can see it here on the map. It's right on the northwestern part of Australia. There is a small peninsula here. It's very remote. It's a mining town with quite a lot of shipping going in and out to ship minerals that are inland. It has a very harsh climate with very few honeybees. And of course, as soon as it was detected there in September 2023, a quarantine was set up. It was put in place until July 2025. I'm not sure whether they extended that or whether that has just lapsed. At the time of the incursion, it was tested for the Deformed Wing Virus and was found to be negative. It was also found to be negative for Varroa mite, and there were no reports of Tropilelaps mites on those red dwarfs. So far, so good. Essentially, one small incursion of an exotic bee in a remote area, nothing really to worry about. At least that's what we thought. Now, some of those bees were collected and they were frozen. And then for some reason, and I'm not sure what the reason was, in February 2025, the Western Australian Department of Primary Industry went back into the freezer and got this sample from 2023 and decided to test it again by PCR. That experiment proved that actually the Deformed Wing Virus was present in those samples from 2023. Now, you could think, well, big deal. You know, it's been just over 2 years since we had those dwarf bees there. They have been exterminated. There is no reason to think that they would have survived. We are about to remove the quarantine area around this site because everything is fine. And then we find those Deformed Wing Virus particles present. Now, in the context of the recent Varroa incursion, this, of course, changed quite a lot. It changed quite a lot because this is the very first time that the Deformed Wing Virus has been detected in Australia. It was previously checked quite extensively by researchers at CSIRO, John Roberts, and he checked extensively hundreds of hives all over Australia and never found the Deformed Wing Virus. So what does that actually mean, and what can we learn from this, and should we be worried or not? So one of the questions we could ask ourselves is, can we think of this as having the Deformed Wing Virus all along, or is it just a unique and first incursion? And there is a paper here in Science a couple of years ago that suggests that the Deformed Wing Virus might have been imported in Australia, and there was actually a part sequence of an Australian Deformed Wing Virus has been published, but no further evidence that it's actually widespread. As I have mentioned in the introduction, the Deformed Wing Virus can infect a large number of pollinators and actually non-pollinating other insects as well. So could it have gone undetected for so long? And is it possible that it was there, but it stayed dormant and nobody really noticed it, especially in the absence of Varroa, which is a major factor to transmitting the Deformed Wing Virus? So let's look at the impact of Varroa in deformed wing virus. And this is another study from Hawaii. It looks at how things have evolved there. And in Hawaii, we had incursion of Varroa. It sort of spread. This study actually also published in Science in 2012, so just over 10 years ago. They saw that there was deformed wing virus, but the prevalence was really low. And interestingly enough, you had a wide variety of different strains of deformed wing virus. Each of those different colors here represents a different strain. And as you can see, there is 10 or 12 of those different strains of deformed wing virus. So quite a high diversity before Varroa was present, or in islands where Varroa was not present. In Maui, and we have seen that island in the first slide. However, in Big Island, we actually have deformed wing virus was introduced, and you can see that over time, and especially if Varroa has been there for a while, what you tend to have is that deformed wing virus diversity diminishes, and you get less and less different strains of deformed wing virus. Up until Varroa is present after several years of exposure, then you end up with just the one strain. Interestingly enough, also the prevalence increases dramatically, up to 100% in some cases, and the diversity decreases at the same time. Also in that paper, they say that they had up to 1 million-fold increase in the number of Varroa particles or Varroa copies per bee. So when Varroa is present, you have a much greater transmission, not only between hives, but also within the same hive. So the number of particles, the number of viral copies in each bee increases dramatically when Varroa is present. Now let's look at our neighbors from New Zealand and their experience. Of course, Varroa there, as most of you would know, especially if you have been a member of the club and have participated in the Saturday meetings, we talk about that quite regularly. They detected Varroa first in 2000. According to the epidemiologists, it could have been present up to 3 to 5 years earlier. We don't know exactly when it was introduced. It was introduced in the Northern Island close to Auckland initially, and this is the distribution. So in 2001, we can see that a year after the first detection, it's quite prevalent in the northern part of the island, but not yet in the southern part. Then 2004, it sort of migrates down. 2006, it jumps from the North Island to the South Island. So it took them 5 years to actually jump from one island to the next. And then slowly but surely, it sort of makes its way down. And over a 10, 12-year period, everything is infected. And we can actually expect something very similar in Australia, pretty much what we have seen in the last couple of years, a gradual spread of the Varroa mite. Now let's look at deformed wing virus. So samples were taken in 2001 and 2003. They were taken obviously in the northern part of the North Island. And all of those samples tested were found to be free from deformed wing virus. They didn't have deformed wing virus, but they had Varroa. They thought, well, you know, we have dodged a bullet here until 2007. And in 2007, a beekeeper actually detected a sample of bees where he could see deformed wings in his colony. So he actually looked at the colony and saw that they had symptoms of deformed wing virus. He contacted the biosecurity organizations in New Zealand, and in March 2007, the Biosecurity New Zealand had a public announcement that deformed wing virus now was officially found in Northland and Waikaiko, which essentially are those two areas here, just north of Auckland and south of Auckland. So they had deformed wing virus was detected there in a couple of colonies. There was speculation in one of the papers that this deformed wing virus actually was present in the initial incursion of Varroa in 2000, and that was the origin of it. I have talked to an epidemiologist, Mark Stevenson, who is from New Zealand and actually studied Varroa mite quite extensively and the outbreak there quite extensively before he moved from New Zealand to Melbourne. And he told me that it's very unlikely that this deformed wing virus would have been present in 2000 in the initial incursion, because it would have been found in a lot more cases than just 7 years later. Varroa being first able to be a host for deformed wing virus, where it can replicate inside the Varroa mite, and the fact that literally thousands and thousands of hives were infected with Varroa without any form of deformed wing virus for such a long period of time suggests very strongly that the Deformed Wing Virus did not come directly with the initial incursion, but was acquired later. And the question then is, where could it come from? And I think that that's a particularly important question for us here in Australia. Of course, we have seen that we already had an incursion in an imported bee colony. So where could it come from? One of the things is that the initial Varroa infestation, it's possible, but unlikely. The authors that speculated that it was an initial one actually doesn't provide any evidence for that. It could come from an independent incursion, either from honeybees that have moved to New Zealand, or in our case, of course, Australia would be in the same boat, another Varroa mite incursion, or an incursion by a large range of different insects. And remember the first slide that I put up, where we could see that a large range of insects, including flies and cockroaches and all sorts of different insects, were host to this particular pathogen. I was wondering whether actually the Deformed Wing Virus can be transmitted by honey. And so I did quite an extensive literature search on that and found that, yes, imported honey can contain the Deformed Wing Virus, and the Deformed Wing Virus can survive at least for some time in honey. And feeding infected honey to bees will, at a very low incidence, it will transmit the Deformed Wing Virus to honeybees if you feed infected honey. In Australia here, import about 8,800 tons of honey every year. I would say that it's very likely, considering that most hives overseas are infected, that some of that honey would be infected with the Deformed Wing Virus. Of course, we normally are not supposed to feed any honey to honeybees, but when you import that sort of volume, chances are some will be spilled somewhere and will be fed inadvertently to some honeybees. As I said, transmission is very inefficient from honey to honeybees, but the volumes and the numbers could actually work against us. So I think it's possible that we would have an importation at some stage of the Deformed Wing Virus in Australia through honey, particularly if now we have combining that with a Varroa incursion, we have a spreading of Varroa. That would mean that we may well have a situation where the Deformed Wing Virus will become very widespread, just like it was in New Zealand. So I think that's not a good situation to be in. It is also possible that it would come through infected pollen. In fact, pollen that is collected from colonies that are infected with the Deformed Wing Virus will have a very low titer of the Deformed Wing Virus, but it's relatively unstable. So after a couple of days, the infectivity of pollen diminishes dramatically. So it's less likely that we would get a Deformed Wing Virus in Australia through importation of pollen, even though, of course, imported pollen is used in our hives quite regularly. It is also possible that it might already be here, but at a very low prevalence. And of course, there is this study from John Roberts at CSIRO, which is quite a number of years old now, but where he extensively looked and couldn't find any. Now, because you can't find it doesn't mean that it's not here. And of course, it would be present at a very low copy number in each hive because there is no Varroa to transmit it from bee to bee. And it would also be at a very low prevalence, which means that only a very small percentages of the hives might be infected. And even if you checked a couple of hundreds compared to the 600,000 hives or so that are in Australia, that's a very small number indeed. And of course, as far as I'm aware, we have never checked other insects systematically for the Deformed Wing Virus, and we know that they can be infected as well. So what does all that mean? One of the questions is, why was it not detected in 2023? And this is JP's views. What I've said so far is largely what I found in the literature, and now I'd like to actually move and say what I think of all of those things. It was not detected in 2023. Of course, we didn't have Varroa mite, especially in Western Australia. Still don't have it in Western Australia at the time. If Varroa is present in this colony, it would be at a very low copy number, and it would be very difficult to detect. And it might just have been missed. And the reason that it might be missed is that you only check a relatively small number of bees, maybe a couple of hundred bees. And if there's very few Varroa particles, then you might just miss it. It's a numbers game. But the implication is, if we missed it once in 2023, does that mean that it could have been missed by John in his paper in 2017, where he looked for it quite extensively and concluded that it was not here? So I think we need to be prepared that it might already be here and we just haven't seen it yet. Should we be worried about it? I think we should be worried about it, especially if at some stage in the future, Varroa and Deformed Wing Virus would cross paths. Of course, we know that Varroa is not yet present in Western Australia. I think that Western Australia is probably one of the last places on Earth where Varroa will be, because they have a very strict quarantine system and because they are protected very, very large expanse of desert where it would be very difficult for Varroa to cross unless it crossed the nullarbor on the back of a truck. So that's a very good protection. I think that it's actually a better protection from Varroa compared to Tasmania here, where we are merely one boat trip away from an incursion. And, it's an overnight boat trip between Melbourne and Tasmania. It's several days of driving through an arid country to go to Western Australia. So I think the probability of having Varroa spread to Western Australia is much lower than the probability of getting it to Tasmania. Let's hope it never gets here, though. I think it's unlikely that it would spread very rapidly from this incursion site, first because it was eradicated. Of course, we don't know whether it was eradicated before it could infect some local insects. We know that there are no managed bees on this peninsula, and also it has been considered a quarantine area. So that might suggest that it will be localized there. On the other hand, it's very, very hard to control native insects, particularly things like cockroaches or native stingless bees or any other of the range of insects that I have listed on my first slide. It's very hard to control them. And of course, at some stage, there will be some traffic between this area and other parts of Australia. There's workers there that would go back home to Perth and other places. There's flights in and out of that area. So it is possible that we would get some. If it's spread to other parts of Western Australia, then we might have a problem. If it's spread to other parts of Australia, we definitely have a problem, particularly if it intersects with places which have Varroa. And I think it's much more likely that the Deformed Wing Virus will migrate to places where we have Varroa rather than Varroa going to this particular small peninsula. Of course, this incursion with the Deformed Wing Virus has happened once, so it could happen again in any other port. It could happen also through infestation with a number of other insects. We have seen that. And there are other ways of the Deformed Wing Virus to spread, including importation of honey. Now, we would not actually see any of those things unless Varroa is present, because that would certainly amplify the viral load both inside the hives and between hives. So what can we do about it? I think we should start to screen quite urgently for Deformed Wing Virus, particularly in areas where Varroa is present, to see whether we can track that intersection of those two diseases. This being said, it's not easy for an individual beekeeper to do those tests. Not many beekeepers have access to PCR, so I think we need a national program. If we find it, we could try to keep the Deformed Wing Virus and Varroa as separate as possible and beware of the possibility of infestation via imported honey. From a beekeeper's perspective, I think one of the things that we will need to do if the Deformed Wing Virus suddenly becomes more widespread, to manage our Varroa much more carefully. Varroa plus Deformed Wing Virus is much more lethal to hives than Varroa alone. In fact, Varroa alone can reach very high Varroa counts before the hive dies out. It's in the order of several hundreds mites per test, while if there is Deformed Wing Virus, you have to start treating as soon as you see a couple of Varroa mites in a sugar shake or in an alcohol test. So we will have to keep a tap on that and adapt as things progress. And on this note, I'll probably leave it at that. Thank you very much. And I'm glad to answer some questions if you have any.
You mentioned that Deformed Wing Virus infects a lot of other insects. Apart from in honeybees, does it have any signs of infection? Does it negatively affect any of them?
I don't know any of them. What I know is that the red dwarf honeybee doesn't show any symptoms. I think it varies. In some insects it does, and in others it doesn't. And that includes different types of bees. I think that from memory, I think that Serrana actually has some symptoms, but I'm not sure. I would have to check. It doesn't necessarily show any symptoms in other insects, including some other bees would actually not show any symptoms. So the symptoms and the infection are quite separate things altogether.
Thanks, JP.
So just got a question from Steve asking, how does deformed wing virus survive in processed honey, and how would you treat honey to eliminate before it comes to Australia?
Like all viruses, unless it encounters a host cell, it's a pretty inert sort of organism. It has just a number of proteins and then some genetic material, in this case, a large RNA molecule. It just sits there, and as it happens, honey is a medium where this particular virus is quite stable in, as opposed to in pollen, when it's attached to the outside of a pollen grain, then it is much more exposed to the environment, and it is a lot less stable in that particular situation. So it doesn't need to reproduce. Of course, it doesn't reproduce in honey or on pollen for that matter. It just sits there, waiting for a host to come along, and then a bee or another insect eats this honey, ingests the Varroa particle. The Varroa particle finds a suitable host cell. It enters the cell, the genetic material is released, and the replication just starts. It just survives there. It doesn't replicate. Now, in terms of what we could do about it, the amount of honey that is imported, 8,800 tons of it, it will be impossible to really treat all of it to prevent infestation of the volumes are just too high. The only way that I could see that you could do that sort of thing would be through irradiation. Irradiation will actually kill the virus. It's a single-strand RNA virus, so gamma radiation would destroy the genetic material in the virus and effectively neutralize it. I doubt that they would ever consider that for all imported honeys. I think that imported pollen needs to be irradiated depending on which country it comes from. It would be just impossible to do with the volume of honey that is imported. Also, they would probably not just start to do that now because they haven't done it for the last, so many years. We have imported honey for many decades. It's unlikely that suddenly they would start to change their protocols to try to prevent that infestation. That's my personal opinion, not something that I read.
Okay, thanks, JP, and thanks for Steve for the question. Louise, you've got a question, please.
Yes, deformed wing virus coming in honey. Is that the only thing that comes in this honey?
Possibly not. Quite a lot of studies have been done with, pesticide contaminants, including miticides in imported honey, and it's obviously much higher than what it is in Australia. In terms of other diseases, it's likely that some other viruses would survive in honey. This being said, quite a lot of the other viruses are present already in Australia. Where they came from, I have no idea, and I didn't look at that in great detail. Deformed wing virus is clearly the biggest problem associated with Varroa and results in most hive losses compared to some of the other viruses that are present. So it's the biggest problem that we have to deal with.
Thanks, JP.